This is the first time I presented my new book in Columbia, and as Kaylee said, First in the Homes of His Countrymen came out this winter from UVA Press. And it was an outgrowth of my dissertation, but it became a much larger project, in part because I developed a direct relationship with Mount Vernon, the entity that is Mount Vernon, over the course of the past 6 years, which really changed the scope of the project and funded it significantly. I became one of the first fellows at the new let me make sure I get the name right, Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of Mount Vernon. Is that right, Robin? Robin's in the back. And so I was one of their first fellows, and I lived at Mount Vernon for 3 months and did my research on the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And I got to tell you, there is nothing like having a cocktail on George Washington's piazza. It was truly, and those of you who know me know I like a cocktail or two. It really changed my perspective on this place and deepened my appreciation for it and highlighted a lot of things that I had begun to believe about it. In addition to spending time at Mount Vernon, I've also developed really close friendships and colleague relationships with many people at Mount Vernon. Robin Adams at the back is a former Mount Vernon friend, and that's really changed my perspective on a lot of things Mount Vernon and George Washington related to, and it's continuing my scholarship on Mount Vernon. I've been working on a project recently with a curator at Mount Vernon on a series of paintings done in the 1830s of Mount Vernon. So there's legs to this that are continuing through this relationship. So this is a snapshot of the book today. I'm not going to give it all away because I want y'all to buy it, but let's go ahead and get started. In 1934, 1.4 million Americans found a time machine that allowed them to travel back in time to see colonial America. They heard the bells toll at Old North Church, where Paul Revere hung lanterns in the steeple to warn of the coming British Army. They had their fortunes told at the Witch's House, adjacent to the House of Seven Gables, made famous in Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel. They popped over to Betsy Ross's shop to see how the flag sewing was going. They marveled at the luxurious lives of colonial leaders in the governor's palace from Williamsburg. If they got hungry, they grabbed a bite at Williamsburg's Village Tavern, where they could watch a drill or dance on the village green. But the destination for all of these time travelers was Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. There they could sit in the shade of the famed piazza and bask in his glory. Now, I know many of you are not time travelers, but that you have been to many of these places, and you know that they're not all next to each other. Old North Church is in Boston, Williamsburg is miles away in Virginia from Mount Vernon, Betsy's little house is in Philadelphia, whether or not she actually sewed the flag there. Ben Franklin's print shop burned down in the 19th century, so what am I talking about? All of colonial America was ripe for the picking at the Colonial Village at the 1934 Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. 20 years before Disneyland, this was a fantasy world of American historical buildings. 2.5 acres big, with buildings constructed of plywood and cardboard. This was a place where visitors could roam about like actors on a stage. Most buildings were smaller than those that they copied, and this is important to me to kind of shove it in the face of all those Disney scholars. This idea to make buildings just a tiny bit smaller, just a little bit smaller, maybe so the difference in scale being imperceptible in a way, is something that Disney used on Main Street to make people more comfortable and therefore spend more money. Some of the buildings were less like their originals and more than just size. The architect of the village took the Old North Church in Boston and decided he wanted to make it more colonial, so he added this porch. But this also gave a place for tired tourists to have a little rest on a hot day. This is really phony colony at its best. The Colonial Village was a place for Americans to play with American history. Based on real historical figures and events and people, it assumed that visitors knew just enough about America's material past in order to recognize it when they saw it. It relied on very specific details, the stocks. This is how many of you have pictures of you or your kids in the stocks at Williamsburg? 7 gables, count them, on the house of 7 gables. These little details gave a sense of authenticity. But in the end, each building relied on the next. It was the ensemble that created the tableau that brought the whole thing together. Now, this was just one of 14 foreign villages at the 1934 fair. And this was a way for people to transcend space and time all along one single midway. And I got way into researching all these villages. They were super funny. There was a midget village. There was Little Switzerland, where they had a real problem with the goats eating the cardboard mountain. You could go to medieval Europe or the Far East, anywhere you could imagine. These were enormously popular. These fantasy lands provided obvious contrasts to the high-tech version of the future at the fair. And many of you have seen pictures of George Keck's House of Tomorrow from Chicago in 1934. The contrast between medieval Europe or historic America with this very high-tech future prompted fairgoers to pat themselves on the back and say, we've come a long way. It reminded people that the past was very far away in comparison to what was happening in the present. I mean, the House of Tomorrow, it's just tomorrow, and there's a hangar there for your plane. You can park it right underneath the house, ready to go. The house is entirely glass. It's completely air-conditioned. Comfort is available. Man is overcoming nature. Both the vision of the near future and the distant past invited Americans to escape right in the center of the Great Depression. They offered alternative realities of everyday life that you could escape to for at least a few hours. You could retreat into the past or project yourself into what you can imagine the future would look like. Now, we could stop here and say, all right, people replicated Mount Vernon and danced around the maypole in front of it in order to escape. This is just pure escapism. Nobody wanted to be in the America of 1934. But it's not that simple, and otherwise I wouldn't have a book. The Colonial Village was part of a much larger impulse to copy or at least appropriate features of historic buildings into popular architecture. This was not just happening at the World's Fair. This was a widespread phenomenon. How many people live in houses that have shutters that don't shut? Raise your hands now. There you go. And this is still happening. I just ripped mine off. I couldn't take it anymore. This sense of using historic architectural features in contemporary architecture really exploded by the 1930s in this country, in all building types, in all places, and by Americans of all classes. But how? How did copying historic American buildings become a strategy for contemporary architecture? Why was this something Americans even wanted to do? Today, I'd like to suggest that the key to understanding the fair buildings that we started with and the larger phenomenon of, replicated historic architecture in the United States is historic preservation. The preservation of historic landscapes, architecture, and interiors not only inspired this kind of replication, but also provided the raw material for people to copy. The 1920s and 1930s was the dawn of a new era in historic preservation in the United States, prompted in part by the opening of Colonial Williamsburg. You see this fair lady over here in front of the Governor's Palace on the left, and then the opening of the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1924, which was the first large-scale installation of American interiors in an American museum. And this was really a shift because for the previous 2 generations of historic preservation in the United States, the work was done mostly by amateurs. And we can kind of categorize that group of folks as those searching for their ancestors, searching for a connection to people, to specific people, specific events. This is the chair that George Washington sat in. But by the 1920s and 1930s, we have this shift in focus. We have this shift in concern and motivation. And people start thinking about American interiors and American architecture more for its aesthetic value. They start tracing it as academics. Preservation became professional. With that, we had new standards, priorities, and best practices. So for the first time, groups of professional researchers were using academic research techniques to determine what the material of the past felt and looked like. Architects carefully measured buildings to determine their dimensions, to determine how they were built. Landscape architects started using archeology to determine the location of historic features rather than just covering everything in boxwood. Interior specialists systematically studied the evolution of very specific forms, chair legs and table forms. And the result of this is that we had a completely new relationship between professional preservation and popular architecture. And with this new relationship came a new tension, as these two groups of people relied on entirely different priorities with the same material. Those looking to appeal to broad audiences for commercial purposes wanted to include just enough history to ensure that consumers interpreted it as part of the past. They picked and chose authentic historical details, but always just to give a brief, very quickly readable impression of what the past looked and felt like. And you better believe that past was always pleasant because they wanted you to spend money. Curators and museum professionals wanted to ensure that the real thing was carefully maintained and interpreted. They wanted to make sure that they possessed in the real thing a kind of authority that the commercial interpreters of history did not. But when we look more closely, we realize that these two sides needed one another very much. Both sides are using the same source material. The popular audiences needed the real thing to draw upon for the replicas. The preservationists needed the real thing for their authority, but also needed the audiences to see it. But what these sides meant is very, very different. Colonial Williamsburg, for an example, was an attempt to revere the material past, an attempt to put it on a pedestal, to get you to recognize it as aesthetically and historically significant in the development of humanity, just like the Mona Lisa. The Colonial Village was all about having fun. Today, I'd like to catch us up to the 1930s to explain how we got to this moment of high tension between popular architecture and historic preservation. I'll explain why and how copying historic architecture became a strategy for relating to the past in American culture. And you better believe it, it's all going to come back to Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is the key for understanding this back and forth between popular architecture and historic preservation. As the first house museum with in situ simulated interiors, and that is very important to get that. If you're going to say something is a first, you have to make sure you get it right. This is the first house museum to have interiors interpreted fully in situ in the house. This has always been the gold standard bearer for historic preservation in this country. But it's also a home. It was George and Martha Washington's home, and it's captivated Americans since the Washington's lifetime in the 18th century. It has become an icon of domestic life, imitated at every scale and in every aspect of material life throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Mount Vernon has been copied longer in more places and for a wider variety of reasons and functions than any other American building. The Alamo is catching up with us. Mount Vernon is in part the most famous American building because it has been replicated at such a large scale. And in this, we see the tension between historic preservation and popular culture writ large. So let's go back to George. Let's make sure we understand what Mount Vernon meant during his lifetime. This is a print made in 1799, just a month or two before Washington's untimely death. George Washington was, of course, America's first president. But Americans knew about it even before he died. Keep in mind that during Washington's lifetime, we didn't have a White House, and we did not have a Capitol building. There was not a single building that represented America other than Mount Vernon. 18th century Americans equated this house with making Washington a good leader. It was the hero's house, but it was also what made him fit to lead a democracy, fit for him to be a new kind of democratic leader. So what's going on in this print? This print lauds one of two major, very public and very calculated resignations George Washington makes from power in his lifetime. Here, he is resigning his commission from the Continental Army at the end of the Revolution, a moment when he could have easily stepped in and taken control. He steps down a second time in 1797 when he leaves his second term of the presidency. And a story I always tell my students is this is such a national park story. I was at Independence Hall one summer. It was really hot. And I was sitting in the little building that's next to Independence Hall. Those of you who've been there, if you're facing the side you go into, the non-street side, it's on the left. And I was done. It was hot outside. I was just tired. And then I perked up when the park ranger said, "What happened here is more important than what happened in Independence Hall." I was like, "Oh yeah, what? What's he gonna say?" And he said, "This is where John Adams was inaugurated." I thought about it. I said, "Yeah, I buy that." Because John Adams' inauguration, the fact that Washington chose not to pursue another term when he could have been elected unanimously, proved that democracy worked. So Washington's disinterest in power, his willingness to step away, was what marked him as a good leader for 18th century Americans. It proved that the experiment could work. So here we see Washington handing with his right hand, symbolically, because it's represented by medieval armor, which we all know he wore at Valley Forge. He's handing it over to the seated figure of America, who represents the government, represents the people. So he's literally giving up power with his right hand. Well, what's he doing with his left hand? He's gesturing to Mount Vernon. So I argue that Mount Vernon is key to understanding why 18th century Americans revered Washington so much. They saw his disinterest in power, his willingness to walk away from it, as the thing that made him fit to lead a democracy. But that doesn't work unless you know what he's resigning for, where he's going to go when he leaves power. He goes to Mount Vernon, not once, but twice. And what this also tells me is that in 1799, the artist here, John James Barrellet, could rely on his audience knowing enough about what Mount Vernon looked like to include just about half of it. You have the piazza, you have the cupola, and then you have the sloping down to the river, and he threw in a couple little oxen there just to make sure you knew it was a farm. But this is shorthand. In 1799, Washington isn't even dead yet. Americans knew what Mount Vernon looked like before Washington died. They were able to recognize it. And the piazza and cupola, this combination of two pretty rare features on a house. In fact, the piazza is entirely novel in American architecture. You can search all you want for the source of this. Washington devised this. It was, the best solution for that view, best place to have a cocktail. This combo of architectural features was known before his death as being directly related to him, therefore directly related to his power, therefore directly related to his disinterest in it, and therefore his suitability for president. After Washington's 1799 death, over the next 50 years, Mount Vernon only became more popular. People scrambled to see it. And the Washington descendants that inherited the house increasingly talked about how they felt like they lived in a fishbowl. And they pretty much lived upstairs because there were so many people peeping in through the windows. People traveled to see it. They got permission to come inside. They wanted to see the space that Washington had inhabited, to touch the things that he touched. And there were a very few few things left over from Washington's life there, including the key to the Bastille, which is between these two doors here, as you see these two visitors in the 1840s admiring in the hallway at Mount Vernon. This is the only object still in the same place that Washington put it at Mount Vernon. It has never moved. And this key was given to Washington by the General Lafayette. People believed they had a right to see Mount Vernon, that Mount Vernon was theirs, even though it was very much still a private residence of the Washington family. And as people kept going, they started to get more concerned. None of the Washington descendants had as much money as Washington. Nobody had as much money as Washington. So the thing wasn't quite as kept up as people expected it to be, as they imagined it had been during Washington's lifetime. The tomb, as painted here in the 1830s by John Gadsby Chapman, was especially sticky. So much so that people complained that this was just a complete blot on American history, that this was a disgrace to have Washington buried in this little hovel. And so in the 1830s, the family finally agreed and moved his body to a new tomb. People increasingly started talking about how Mount Vernon should be preserved, that it should be a public place, that it should be completely accessible, and that it should be taken back to what Washington knew. The problem with this is that there was absolutely no precedent in the United States for a federally or state-owned museum, that there was no precedent for a house museum, interpreted as somebody in the past would have known it. This seemed like an impossible task. What happens when you have the impossible facing you? You bring in the ladies. Columbia, meet the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, a group of women that campaigned over the course of the 1850s to make the preservation of Mount Vernon possible. And this is all led by Anne Pamela Cunningham. Anybody tell me where she's buried? Just up the street. Go visit her, pick a weed. It looks pretty good. Her grave is pretty dramatic. Anne Pamela is the one seated with the white doily on her head, of course, looking at the bust of her hero. Led by Anne Pamela Cunningham, this group of intrepid women raised $200,000, or more than $5.5 million in today's money, from nothing. They raised it from pennies collected from school children, from Edward Everett, the revered speaker who went around the country giving speeches on their behalf. They argued that as women, they were uniquely positioned to purchase Mount Vernon and to operate it on behalf of the American public. They pointed to the male politicians who couldn't get it together, and frankly, were busy getting ready to figure out how to secede, as far as we were concerned here in Columbia. They pointed at these male politicians and said, y'all can't find a solution. We've got it. We'll be able to do what you can't do. They claimed that as women, they were uniquely positioned to do the job, not just of buying Mount Vernon, opening it to the public, but protecting what Mount Vernon meant. To keep Washington, his memory, Mount Vernon, its memory, out of the increasingly sectional and heated political fray. As politically disenfranchised people, even though some of them were married to very politically important men, they imagined that they could present a more neutral, truthful understanding of the history of the first president. Anne Pamela Cunningham wrote in her call to arms, which she extended to all women, and in fact, the Grand Council of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association did include women from many different states, North and South, who operated as equals. It is woman's office to be a vestal, and even a fire of liberty may need the care of her devotion and the purity of her guardianship. Your hearts are fresh, reverential, and elevated by lively sensibilities and elevating purposes. So not only was the Mount Vernon Ladies Association positioning themselves to protect the house from ruin, but also to protect what Mount Vernon meant. As politically neutral, supposedly, Americans, they could keep Mount Vernon from being volleyed back and forth in an increasingly heated political environment. The problem with the ladies' goal of neutrality is that when you preserve something, you have to make choices. It's ultimately impossible to recreate the past exactly as it was. When the Mount Vernon Ladies Association purchased the house, it was completely empty. So they had a lot of choices to make. The Bastille Key, John Anton Houdon's bust of George Washington, and a handful of other things were the only objects in the house. And this, to me, is one of the most fascinating moments, and really where you see the just amazing work that these women were able to do in taking an empty 10,000 square foot house. Mount Vernon is really big, and turning it into a museum that we know today. Their first choice was an approach, and their mission is the same today as it was in 1859. They wanted to recreate the space in which Washington lived. And I love this because it's ultimately impossible. So it's constantly optimistic. Nobody can ever know exactly. We can do all the paint analysis. We can do all the research. Mount Vernon is the most well-documented house in the world, but we're still making choices. By recreating the space in which Washington lived, they started to use furniture and textiles to give the feeling that you could walk back in time, that you could enter Mount Vernon and feel the way that Washington had felt. By filling Mount Vernon with furniture, the ladies were making choices that offered a very particular view of Washington. This was a domestic view. This was one rooted in the power of objects, architecture, and the physical environment to influence a person. They believed that Mount Vernon made Washington a better person. And again, it's the place where he goes back to. It's the place he's always yearning for when he's in power, the reason why he's able to step away. But they also believed that that same influence of this place was applicable to today's Americans, that if it made Washington a better leader, Mount Vernon could also shape contemporary Americans into better citizens. Sarah Grace Hale, who was the influential editor of the Ladies' Home Journal and a big proponent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, wrote about the ladies' goals. Washington's greatest worth was not in his public example. We must set his private life before young America and keep in the hearts of the people the love of his private virtues. This is the lamp of goodness which, like the sacred fire on the altar, should always be burning in the homes of our land. This was believed to be not just a sacred place, but a sacred mission. They searched far and wide for objects owned and used by the Washingtons. They filled in around things that they knew Washington owned or chairs he sat in with old things to create convincing tableaus. And one of my favorite stories is about this harpsichord, which is one of the first objects to come back to Mount Vernon. This was a double manual harpsichord given by George Washington to his step-granddaughter, Nellie Custis, in 1793. It's a London-made piece purchased in Philadelphia. It was donated by Nellie's daughter-in-law just as the ladies took over the property. And they used it as the central object in the little parlor, which is a little parlor that faces onto the riverside. This is something that they imagined visitors imagining a world around. They set a rosewood flute on the piano, as if you could imagine Nellie playing, Washington getting bored over in his study and coming over, picking up the flute and joining his sweet granddaughter. They filled in around this authentic objects things that looked old. Federal sofa and chairs, a colonial revival cabinet in the corner. The idea here was to create a scene in which visitors could imagine historical actors. They could imagine themselves with their own families, and they could better emulate Washington's example. As they were interpreting the house, the ladies also set about documenting and publicizing what they were doing in an attempt to control the narrative about Mount Vernon. They were, I think, the first museum to develop sophisticated licensing policies for photographic images. When the Mount Vernon Ladies Association purchased Mount Vernon, photography was very much in its infancy. And they made a rule in 1865 that any photographer wanting to come onto the grounds to take pictures of Mount Vernon had to get their permission. They figured out a way to make money off of it. But it was also a way to control what people knew about Mount Vernon. And so these stereographs, commissioned by Alexander Gardner, the famed war photographer who came out of Tom Brady's office, studio, he created this series of images that allowed people to experience Mount Vernon after they had gone, or to experience Mount Vernon if they didn't have the opportunity to get there in person. So these are stereographs, 2 photographs taken almost from the same place, but not quite, that when seen through a little viewer, they seem to merge together to become a single 3-dimensional image. On the back is a list of all the images in the series, so that if you sit in your armchair in your Victorian parlor and go through one by one, you too can visit Mount Vernon. By the 1890s, the ladies recognized that the personal camera was just too tempting and available of a device for them to control, and so they dropped their ban on unsanctioned images of the house's interiors. But they continued to use images, to use handbooks, to use postcards, to control the image of the house, to control the image of their own organization and their own stewardship. So thanks to the access that the ladies provided to the American public, more and more people became interested in Mount Vernon by the end of the 19th century. They made the house available through pictures. They made the house available through visits. And as part of a growing interest in historic American architecture, Americans began to generate their own visual and historic material unsanctioned by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. It became increasingly impossible for the ladies to keep hold on what Mount Vernon meant. Mount Vernon was among the earliest historic buildings in the United States to be measured and drawn. Measured drawings or documentation, somebody in this room has done a measured drawing with me, is a very common practice today. This was a means to preserve the exact dimensions of a historic building, but also to look closely at a historic building to determine how it's put together. And that's really important for a house like Mount Vernon, which at its core is a 1740s house built by George Washington's father. So by drawing it, measuring it, looking very closely at it, people start to figure out different things about Mount Vernon, how it's put together, how Washington made changes over time. The first set of measured drawings of Mount Vernon published in the United States were published in 1900 in the multi-volume set, The Georgian Period. And if you're looking for something pretty to look at and something very boring to fall asleep to, this is a good bet. It's on Google Books. By the 1910s, within a decade of this publication, an architecture critic could proclaim, Mount Vernon has so often been proclaimed the first example of colonial architecture in the country that one almost risks the accusation of treason by denying it. I totally messed up that quote. It was treasonous to not find Mount Vernon amazing. As more and more information about Mount Vernon became available, Americans start replicating it, or its most recognizable parts, in full scale. And this is where I start to really have fun. Private houses, beginning with prominent New York firms such as McKim, Mead & White, began to use Mount Vernon as inspiration. McKim, Mead & White first start working with Mount Vernon's famed piazza in Hillstead, the house that you see on the upper left, and then on the image on the right. And Hillstead was the home of the parents of Theodate Pope Riddle, who worked with McKim, Mead & White to design a house with a front porch on it that looked a lot like Mount Vernon. We know she owned the Georgian period. We know that she could have copied it from that. She'd also been to Mount Vernon very recently, so she could have been inspired directly. She could have sat on that piazza and been inspired, as I often am. After McKim, Mead & White, their house was published in fancy design magazines, encouraging other architects that were fantasizing to be them directly. So below Hillstead, we have, as another example, this is John Russell Pope, the architect of the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery in Washington. This is this is the house for Collier, the newspaper magnate of 1911. And on the bottom, the very unfortunately named Muttontown Meadows in Long Island, designed by Delano and Aldrich, the very exciting New York firm in the 1910s. And you'll notice that this is the west side of Mount Vernon rather than the Piazza side. So this starts to get rolling in prominent New York architecture circles. These are my favorite. Mount Vernon at the same time is being replicated in full scale at World's Fairs. It's replicated 3 times between 1893 and 1926. The first 2 here on the right were at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition and the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, both replicated by the state of Virginia. At the bottom right, this is the Young Women's Christian Association's building at the fair nobody went to, the 1926 Sesquicentennial Exposition. It rained and it was very muddy. But this was a very popular attraction for the few people that did go. Now, Mount Vernon wasn't the only historic American building replicated at World's Fairs. On the left here, you see a version of Independence Hall and John Hancock's house that also showed up at the World's Columbian Exposition. But Mount Vernon was replicated more faithfully and more often than any other. But these replicas weren't all the same. In 1893, the state of Virginia tried to actually get stuff from Mount Vernon to go into their replicated interiors. The ladies wouldn't let them go. In 1915, they fudged it. 1826, this is a shell. Or 1926, this is a shell. The inside of this was a totally modern cafeteria where you could get food but not cigarettes. So we know how this happened. Mount Vernon was popular. The ladies' preservation of the house provided something to copy. This was all supplemented by publications like the Georgian period or postcards and guidebooks published by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. But why? Why did this happen? Why was copying Mount Vernon a regular thing? Well, it wasn't enough just to see or visit Mount Vernon. Americans wanted to inhabit it. And the impulse here is really not that different from the ladies' impulse. Both are seeking to recreate a version of Mount Vernon. The difference is that the ladies had the real thing, and that in fact, the copies are copying the Mount Vernon Ladies Association's interpretation of it. The replication of Mount Vernon was a testament to the success of the ladies' approach to preservation. By 1890, no one alive could recall the arrangement of Washington's parlor, so if people are copying it, they're copying the Mount Vernon Ladies Association's conception of it. Even more importantly, by the 1890s, by the 1910s, Mount Vernon had become so recognizable, so available, and so accessible that it became flexible. As much as the ladies wanted to hold on to that supposedly neutral meaning for Mount Vernon, it could mean anything to anybody. It could communicate to a very wide audience. So if you wanted to use the past to say something about yourself in the present, why not use a building that everybody could recognize, that most people seem to really like? In other words, Mount Vernon could mean anything you wanted it to. It was a palatable way to sell an idea. Now let's talk through a specific example. In 1917, a Baptist preacher named Charles Lewis Fowler opened a university in Atlanta, and he began to plan a campus. He hired a local architect, and he imagined this campus to be composed almost entirely of replicas of buildings important to American and specifically Southern history. He used Mount Vernon as inspiration for a dormitory. He also replicated Arlington House, the home of Robert E. Lee and Washington's step-grandson. Monticello was included, even though Monticello is pretty hard to replicate. There's a dome. Fowler imagined that students would become better citizens when surrounded by such buildings. And this was a really similar approach the ladies had with Mount Vernon when they began to restore it in the 1850s, right? He wrote in the school bulletin, "To live in the atmosphere of these buildings and to imbibe the wholesome spirit of the illustrious men and women who made these buildings famous will constitute a liberal education." But Fowler had a really specific idea about the kind of education these buildings would provide. Fowler and his fellow faculty members, including William J. Simmons, who you see here, were deeply involved in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1910s and 1920s in Atlanta. Simmons taught Civil War and Reconstruction history, you can imagine what that syllabus looked like, at the school at the same time that Fowler was planning this campus, and he was also the Klan's imperial wizard or supreme leader. He was credited with reviving the KKK in Atlanta in the 1910s, and in 1921, the Klan purchased the school, he became president, and they devised plans to turn it into, quote, a pure American university. Now, the whole thing fell apart in 1922. Mount Vernon was never built. In fact, the only building to be built was the Arlington House replica here at the, I don't know where here it is. Here, that's the only one that would be built. And in a moment of divine justice, this is now a synagogue, and the whole thing fell apart. But it serves us here as this very striking and timely example of how flexible Mount Vernon's meaning was by the 1920s and how popular Mount Vernon was. It was impossible for its meaning to be neutral. It could be used to sell xenophobia and racism as easily as anything else. Now, throughout such replicas, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association stayed quiet. They were very busy working very hard to improve their interpretation of Mount Vernon by making it more accurate. But this changed in the 1930s when replication hit an all-time high, and especially with these three jobs. The 1932 bicentennial of George Washington's birth and the fervor over Colonial Williamsburg prompted more replicas that were even bolder. A series of very high-profile replicas by Sears, Roebuck and Company was especially upsetting to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Sears created 2 full-scale replicas, one in Paris and one in New York, and then they did the impossible. They made it into a pattern that just anybody could buy, which they called the Jefferson. You have to buy my book to know why it's called the Jefferson. Now, before they had tolerated the replicas, they knew that they were out there, but they really didn't say much. But this was the last straw. They were very concerned that people would believe that they were profiting financially off the replicas. They thought that these replicas, some of them a little dicey, that the one in Brooklyn in particular kind of fell apart. They were worried that these would reflect poorly on how they were acting as stewards of the real thing. The head of the board at the time, Alice Richards, said, "I'm very busy trying to stem these reproductions. We have no legal rights and can only try persuasion." And now we've caught back up with the 1934 Colonial Village, which really sent the board over the edge. They declared it, quote, a more flagrant infringement on our rights than has hitherto occurred. They were angered that the architect and the concessionaire running the Colonial Village had planned to replicate Mount Vernon without ever consulting them, without ever even inquiring about anything specific about Mount Vernon, that they were relying only on published material. They were upset that it wasn't to scale. They were upset that the scale being altered by being made 8/9 of Mount Vernon size, that they were making it precious. They were making it like a dollhouse. None of their lovingly restored interiors were interpreted in the replicas. But they were most upset that the replica was unabashedly commercial. This was essentially a gussied-up carnival attraction, and they did not want to be associated with it. But rather than just get mad, they decided to get involved. They decided to use the replica to their advantage. They accepted that people were going to come to see it, and they decided they were going to make the best at it. The first requirement was that the concessionaire erect a sign declaring that they were the rightful owners of Mount Vernon and that this wasn't the real thing. They were actually worried that people would think that they had moved Mount Vernon from Virginia to Chicago. This was a concern. Americans haven't gotten any smarter. They also commissioned new postcards and watercolors to sell in the replica's gift shop. If the concession was going to make money off Mount Vernon, they were going to profit from it. This was really smart. In the end, they saw a publicity opportunity for the good work they were doing with the real thing. 1.4 million visitors came to the Colonial Village over the course of the summer of 1934. 200,000 paid to go inside the replica itself. Just to give you a sense of scale, that year almost 400,000 went to see the real Mount Vernon. If the ladies couldn't control the replicas, they were at least going to ensure that people got good information on the real thing and that they benefited from the publicity. The Colonial Village finally made the ladies realize that they could not control Mount Vernon's narrative and that that was okay. They turned their back on commenting on the replicas, trying to control Mount Vernon's image in the popular realm by making sure that the work that they did at the real Mount Vernon was the most up-to-date, that it reflected the latest kind of thinking about restoration and about preservation. They sponsored new research on the house and the landscape. They founded a new office of research and restoration, hiring for the first time people with actual history degrees to direct the research and to help them understand how the house evolved. They used archaeology to direct the changes on the grounds. And in 1936, they made the single most dramatic change to the mansion to date. They removed the Chinese Chippendale balustrade from the top of the piazza. They had long known that this was an addition made to the house in the 1810s, 1820s by Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew. But by the 1930s, they finally decided to take it down. Many of them were upset about this, but they recognized that the ultimate goal, if their ultimate mission was to take the house back to what Washington knew, they had to do it. They said that they would, quote, not let sentiment alone govern them in so serious a matter. All of this was designed to help visitors see a true Mount Vernon, to get closer to Washington, and to further differentiate what the ladies were doing at Mount Vernon from what was going on in the rest of the world. Through a renewed commitment to Mount Vernon, they were asserting their authority over popular interpretations. After the 1934 Colonial Village, the ladies more or less turned their back on the replication of Mount Vernon's image in popular culture. They just let it go, water under the bridge. And that was a good thing because the public, they couldn't stop themselves. By the 1950s, Mount Vernon was the architectural source material for two purpose-built building types, motels and funeral homes. They sprang up along the highway from coast to coast. And what we now in the 21st century might forget is in the 1950s, these were new types of buildings. Combined with Mount Vernon, an old familiar form, you get a perfect business model. Mount Vernon helped people feel more comfortable with staying in a hotel or having their mama's funeral in a funeral home. Before, and I've driven past this one in orange 100 million times going to Washington, D.C. from my home in Charlottesville. It is just the sweetest little thing. Before World War II, most funeral homes were operating in converted houses. The Whaley House on Gervais is a great example of those kinds of funeral homes. But by the 1950s and 1960s, most funeral homes were purpose-built, and funeral directors were getting really organized with their lobby. They were eager to reassure customers that they were not profiting off of the loss of others. There was this big push and pull in the funerary industry. And there was a spate of really nasty publicity in the late 50s and early 60s that led them to really want to cement their reputation as being interested in people's welfare rather than taking their wallets. So the Mount Vernon Piazza on these new modern buildings suggested that there was something wholesome, that there was something family-oriented about the business, and that most of all, they could be trusted with your dead relatives. The motel came with the proliferation, of highways after World War II. Before World War II, if you stayed at a motel at all, it was a little motor court where you had a series of cottages kind of clustered along the roadside. But by World War II, we start to see these organized into one long row, often punctuated in the middle or on either side by a lobby, and then all facing onto a big parking lot with a sign. Mount Vernon is perfect for this form. As a Palladian organization, Mount Vernon, with the big block of the house in the center and then the little colonnades on the side connecting to service buildings, this provided the perfect model for a lobby with long rows of hotel rooms coming off of it. And just in case you didn't realize this was supposed to be Mount Vernon, it tells you right there. I was driving in the Northern Neck 2 weeks ago, and I found two Mount Vernon, they were both abandoned, two Mount Vernon motels facing each other on either side of the highway. I had my little dog in the car. He must have thought we were about to get into an accident because I completely lost it. The thing about making these look like Mount Vernon, too, is that they could easily be read from a car moving at 55 miles an hour. You knew what Mount Vernon looked like. You knew that piazza. You knew that cupola. You could say, hey, that one, let's stay at Mount Vernon. The only model for motels that comes close to Mount Vernon is the Alamo. Now, these replicas, so I use that word very loosely. I am not a theorist. Often had little more to do with the real Mount Vernon than the most superficial kind of architectural repetition. And the continued use of the balustrade in the replicas is a case in point. This particular motel, which I can't figure out if it still exists or not, it's right on the border of New York, boasted of its, quote, colonial setting on the back of this postcard, and its name being after Mount Vernon. But what does this mean? Well, you have those inoperable shutters. You know who you are. There's a pediment over the door. There's a tiny cupola with a generic bird weather vane. And then you have this railing, which in the 1950s had been gone from Mount Vernon for almost 20 years. This tells me that by the 1950s, people are copying the replicas. They're copying photographs. They're copying their own memory of what Mount Vernon used to look like earlier in their own lifetimes, which means they're remembering an early interpretation of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association's interpretation. These buildings don't really have to mean anything. Their features recognize Mount Vernon in such a kind of general way. It says, trust me, America, home, much more than it actually references the real Mount Vernon. And this is still very much a thing. People still love replicating Mount Vernon for all sorts of things. And next time you're in Philadelphia, make an appointment to see the building in the middle. This is the funeral home at Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania at Arlington Cemetery. And they have a wonderful collection of George Washington memorial art. And if you're also a Jefferson fan and sometimes get frustrated that he gets left behind, don't worry, there's a mausoleum after Monticello right behind it. People love to copy Mount Vernon, but people also still love to go to Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is the most visited house museum in the country at a time when many house museums are contemplating closing their doors or completely changing their mission. They raised tens of millions of dollars seemingly overnight to open a new presidential library just recently. People still love Mount Vernon. People need the real thing, but they also need the chance to play with it. So these two things, the real thing and the fake, the preciously preserved and the playfully popular, seem diametrically opposed, but they really seriously need one another, and they deserve our serious concern. We can giggle, we can make fun, we can call the bottom kitsch, but don't dismiss it. Because without it, you don't have an audience for the thing above. And without an audience, you have no fun. So thank you all. I'll be glad to take your questions.